More than 1,500 people lost their lives on the night of April 14, 1912, when the RMS Titanic sank after a collision with an iceberg. A small handful of the ship's passengers were from Virginia and West Virginia. They included Philip Axe and Selene Decker, who serendipitously lived several blocks from each other in Norfolk, and Clarence Moore, brother to the mayor of Clarksburg, who was lost in the disaster. Other people in the Virginias missed the Titanic by sheer fate, like Mr. H. M. Walthall of Richmond, who canceled passage on the ill-fated ship at the last minute, and Mrs. Bradley Johnston of Goochland, who had booked passage on Titanic's return voyage to England, which never happened. Two other natives of the Virginias, Robert Daniel and Eloise Smith, survived the sinking of the Titanic. This traumatizing experience, which they both handled very differently, would alter the course of their lives forever. The opening years of the 20th century were the golden age of ocean travel. Shipping companies determined to flaunt the newest and largest ocean liner afloat were engaged in a ceaseless battle of one-upmanship, endeavoring to attract those traveling between Europe and North America, as well as prestigious contracts to carry Britain's Royal Mail. Greyhounds of the North Atlantic, like the Cunard Line's Lusitania and Mauretania, were comfortable, fast, and the pinnacle of modern technology, able to make the 3,000-mile crossing from Liverpool to New York in less than 5 days. Cunard mounted considerable pressure on their direct competitor, the White Star Line, to expand their fleet as well. White Star devised a trio of ships that would be even larger and amongst the fastest on the North Atlantic run. Olympic, the first of the trio, entered service in the autumn of 1911 with resounding success. The second sister, Titanic, entered service in April 1912. A near-carbon copy of her slightly older sister, Titanic was to date the largest ship afloat, measuring 3 football fields in length and with 7 decks above the waterline. Inside, her accommodation was a microcosm of class-conscious Edwardian society. Third class, which appealed to those immigrating to North America. Second class, largely the enclave of middle-class professionals. And first class, whose elegant staterooms attracted the wealthy and powerful. On the morning of April 10, 1912, 27-year-old Robert Daniel boarded Titanic at Southampton, after business had necessitated a lengthy visit to London. Robert was a native of Richmond, and an alumnus of the University of Virginia. His first job was in the traffic manager's office of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, before ultimately segueing to a career in banking. Traveling in first class with Robert was his newly purchased French bulldog. While Robert Daniel was on his way home, some of those boarding Titanic in Southampton were bidding farewell to theirs. The Hart family were among those in second class, leaving England for a new life in North America.
My father was a builder, a master builder, and in England in 1911 business wasn't very good, and he had built a lot of houses which he couldn't let. Now that must sound very odd today, but it was so in those days. And when a friend of his who'd gone to Canada sometime earlier on came home to see him, he said, "You know, why are you putting up with this recession here? Why don't you join me in Canada? Together we could make a real do of things." And then within the space of one evening, my father decided to cut all his losses and go to Canada.
Shortly after noon, Titanic began easing away from the ocean dock. As the harbor pilot guided Titanic downriver past the much smaller liner New York, the suction caused by Titanic's wake pulled New York's mooring lines taut until they snapped. The stern of the New York swung out toward Titanic, and for a moment collision seemed imminent. Thanks to quick intervention from tugboats, New York was pulled away from Titanic with a mere moment to spare. The near miss of the curiously named New York was later read by some as an ominous warning. After a brief delay, Titanic was once again underway. She glided past the Isle of Wight and across the English Channel to her second port of call in Cherbourg, France. Too large to dock in Cherbourg's shallow inner harbor, Titanic dropped anchor in the outer harbor, where passengers, luggage, and mail were tendered from shore. While the ship was at anchor, Robert Daniel sent a telegram to his mother, Harriet Daniel, who lived at the Chesterfield in Richmond. The brief message from her eldest son, which now belongs to the Virginia Historical Society, informed her that he was homeward bound aboard Titanic. Among those to come aboard in Cherbourg were newlywed couple Lucian and Eloise Smith. Lucian came from a wealthy family in Morgantown, whose wealth was based in vast holdings in the coal fields of the Allegheny Mountains. Eloise was the daughter of James Anthony Hughes, who represented West Virginia's 5th Congressional District in the House of Representatives. After their wedding in Huntington in February, Lucian and Eloise set off for an extended honeymoon and sailed for Europe aboard Titanic's nearly identical sister, Olympic. Homesick for the mountains of West Virginia, they cut short their honeymoon and booked passage for New York aboard Titanic. The next morning, Titanic called briefly at Queenstown, Ireland, to collect more passengers and mail, and set off for New York. Irish immigrant Eugene Daly played Aaron's Lament on his bagpipes as the edge of the old world slowly faded over the horizon behind Titanic. The weather for early April on the North Atlantic was mild and calm. In first class, Robert Daniel was enjoying a comfortable passage in a modest cabin on A deck. The Smiths, too, were booked in a comfortable first-class cabin on C deck. While not among Titanic's most lavish staterooms, Robert Daniel and the Smiths still paid several $1,000s each in today's currency for one-way passage. Those traveling in first class could expect the use of 2 staircases, providing access to 7 different decks, a lounge spanning the entire width of the promenade deck, a light and airy palm court, a smoking room reserved for men, a reading and writing room reserved for women, spaces for exercise, including a gymnasium, squash court, and promenade decks, a Turkish bath and swimming pool, and a restaurant and adjacent cafe available for patronage at an additional fare. Before dinner at 7 o'clock, first-class passengers gathered in the reception room at the foot of the forward staircase before being ushered into the first-class dining room, which at that time was boasted as the largest room afloat, with nearly 11,000 square feet. The culinary excellence of the Edwardian age was as celebrated at sea as it was on land, where dinners comprising nearly a dozen courses dominated the tables of high society. At the end of her 3rd full day at sea on April 14th, Titanic was nearing an ice field roughly 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. Despite the hazard to navigation, Titanic was making nearly full steam at 20 knots, or 23 miles per hour. The story of what happened that night has been retold in countless versions over the decades. The most poignant retellings come from recorded interviews with those who survived the disaster. Told half a century or more later, the handful of recorded survivor accounts that exist are sometimes discrepant with one another, and often lack possession of historical details that are well known today. But the voices of those who were aboard Titanic on the night of April 14, 1912, tell the story of one of modern history's great tragedies in a way that no one else can.
The sea was perfectly smooth. Every star in the heavens was visible, but there was no moon. So it was dark. At the time when the iceberg was reported from the crow's nest, when they struck the bells, I was sitting in my cabin having a cup of tea, and immediately got up and walked along to the bridge, about 60 feet away on the same deck. I was about halfway between the officers' quarters, the entrance to the officers' quarters and the bridge, when the crash came, and it didn't break my step. She was doing full speed, and it didn't break my step. And I got to the bridge, and the captain had evidently arrived about the same moment, and I heard him say to Murdoch, what's the matter, what have you stuck? He said, we've stuck an iceberg, sir. He swung her head round towards port, and she was on the swing, and that's why she was torn underneath. She was penetrated in 6 compartments. I met the carpenter coming up, absolutely out of breath, and he said, Mr. Boxall, he said, the forepeak hatch is blown off, and number 1 tarpaulin is ballooning up. He said, she's evidently making water fast.
Now we've been running under a big head of steam, and the sudden stopping of the engines lifted every safety valve, and as a result, the steam roared off at all exhaust. The row was absolutely deafening. Added to that, the engineers started to blow the boilers down. Shout as loud as you like. No one could hear a word. At the same time that Boxall had called me, the order had been given, all hands on deck. I got hold of the boatswain's mate and sort of showed him with my hands that I wanted him to start the men stripping off the boat cover. They were swung out and lowered to the level of the boat deck. Just a little while before they were ready to swing out, I happened to meet the captain, and I asked him, by cupping my hands over his ear and yelling at the top of my voice, shall I get the women and children away, sir? He just nodded, so I started to fill the first boat. Just about now, thank goodness, the roar of escaping steam stopped, and passengers, now they could hear themselves think, started asking me, why are you getting the boats out? And why are you putting women and children in them? I told them it was merely a precaution, and that very likely they'd all be taken on board again at daylight.
And without any words at all, we went out of the cabin and into the lift and up onto the boat deck. Now, if we hadn't done that at that time, I very much doubt I'd be talking to you today, because, as you know, there was accommodation for less than 800 people in the lifeboats, and she was carrying 2,200. So it was a question as who was there in time to get into one of the all too few lifeboats. Well, they weren't launched very quickly, because at first no one thought anything was going to happen.
The drop from the boat deck to the water was about between 70 and 80 feet, and you could hardly see the water, and people didn't want to go. They got in their minds she was unsinkable.
Members of the ship's band assembled on the boat deck near the first-class entrance and began playing to allay the passengers' anxiety. Not far away, Lucian and Eloise Smith were waiting to board lifeboat number 6. Captain Smith barred Lucian from getting into the boat, citing his instruction that women and children were to be given priority. Lucian assured Eloise that this was all precautionary. He kissed her goodbye and urged her to keep her hands in her coat pockets to keep warm. Lifeboat number 6 was launched a few minutes later, with fewer than 30 women aboard and almost 40 empty seats. Nearly a dozen ships had received Titanic's distress call. The only one close was the small steamer Carpathia. Her captain immediately altered course and ordered full steam.
The Carpathia was a 14-knot ship, but that night, for 3.5 hours, she worked up to 17 knots. One of the first things I did, naturally, was to get up the chief engineer and explain the urgency of matters, and calling out an extra watch in the engine room, every ounce of power was got from the boilers, and every particle of steam used for the engineers, turning it from all other uses, such as heating.
Even with her engines working their hardest, it was still expected to take 4 hours for Carpathia to reach Titanic. A sense of unease began to proliferate as Titanic settled ever lower into the water. As lifeboat number 14 was lowered past the promenade deck, Fifth Officer Harold Lowe had to fire several warning shots to deter a group of men from jumping into the already crowded boat.
He put me in the lifeboat and he put my mother in and he said to me, now you look after your mother. And I looked up as this boat went down the side. It's a terribly long way down to that dark sea. I remember looking up and seeing him leaning over, saying, be good, look after Mummy. And that was the last I saw of him. He made no attempt to get to the boat.
As time went on, I could see the bows of the ship getting steadily lower and lower in the water. Now, between lowering one boat and another, I frequently took a run forward and a quick look down a long stairway that led from the boat deck 3 or 4 decks down. Frankly, I'm never likely to forget the sight of that cold greenish water creeping step by step up that stairway. Some of the lights were shining down on the water, and others, already submerged, were giving it a sort of ghastly transparency. But for my purpose, I could tell by that staircase measurement exactly what was happening, how far down she'd gone, and how quickly she was going.
Captain Smith attempted to summon several of the lifeboats back to the ship to take on more passengers, including lifeboat number 6 carrying Eloise Smith. Order and authority had begun to gradually erode. None of the lifeboats heeded the captain's command. Captain Smith ordered 4th Officer Joseph Boxhall into lifeboat number 2. Boxhall was also instructed to row around to the first-class gangway door on the opposite side of the ship to collect more passengers who had been sent below to wait for them.
And about that time, the captain came across the bridge and said, Mr. Boxhall, you go away in that boat, pointing to the port emergency boat number 2. And he said, hurry up, Mr. Wilde is waiting to lower it. I tumbled into this lifeboat and we got lowered down, and I reckon that I had between 30, around about 30 on board the boat. And the captain looked over the side from the bridge and sung out and told me to go round to the starboard side, to the gangway doors, which was practically the opposite side to where I was lowered. When I passed round the boat, to try and get to this gangway door on the starboard side, her propellers were out of water. I'm not certain if I didn't pass underneath them. But when I did eventually reach there, I found that there was such a mob standing in the gangway doors. Really, I daren't go alongside, because if they'd jumped, they would have swamped the boat. She was only a small boat, would hold about 35 people. I decided that it was not, that I daren't go alongside again, and I pulled off and laid off.
Everybody was crying, praying, trying to get into the few lifeboats that were left. No, it was pretty sad at the end.
We had 2 boards on the stern of the Titanic, which said, keep clear of propeller blades. And I was on the port one, hanging on. And eventually I slid off. And I had a life jacket on, and I hit the water with a crash. But I didn't hit anything in the water. I was lucky, very lucky.
The decks were lined with people not getting off. They were lined with people looking over the railing. So when the water rushed into the boilers, there was a terrible explosion. And that's when I thought the boat broke in half. And that's when the people started jumping into the water and screaming. That's when they screamed. It was terrible.
But the most dreadful sound of all is the sound of people drowning. The screams. Absolutely ghastly. My mother used to say sometimes, she couldn't get me to talk about it for years, but if ever anyone did talk to me and I said that, she used to say yes. But do you remember the silence that followed it? And that's quite right. It says the whole world stood still that night. Once the lights had gone, the ship had gone, the sound had gone. Oh, it was dreadful.
Eventually, we saw a rocket go up. And it turned out to be the Carpathia. So she steered for the position that I was in. And consequently, I was the first boat picked up. And the captain kept sending down to know if there was an officer in the boat and send him up at once. But I sent a message back, when I get the boat empty. Eventually the boat emptied, and then I went up to the Captain Rostron on the bridge. And he said, where's the ship? I said, she's sunk. And it was nearly 8 o'clock, I think. As near as I can remember, it was certainly broad daylight when we picked up the other boats. We cruised around in the Carpathia then. And eventually picked up all the other boats.
Eloise Smith was among the 706 survivors rescued by the Carpathia, although her husband Lucian was not among them. If his body was ever recovered, it was not identified. Just a mere 18 years old, the loss of her gentle husband sent Eloise into shock. She may or may not have known that she was also with child the night the Titanic sank. A healthy baby boy was born in November, whom Eloise named after his beloved father. Also among the survivors was Robert Daniel, although his French bulldog unfortunately went down with the Titanic. The story of just how Robert survived is still not fully understood. In an interview with the Richmond Times-Dispatch, Robert gave a colorful account of diving into the sea in the ship's final minutes, wearing nothing more than a bathrobe, after which he was rescued by a lifeboat. This and other similar accounts of Robert's survival contrast at a number of points with the historical record, citing unsubstantiated events and unsupported evidence. One theory is that, like many men, Robert may simply have left the Titanic in one of the first lifeboats launched from the starboard side of the ship, whose officers allowed men to board once there were no other women within sight. Perhaps that truth, if it is the truth, in light of so many women and children who ultimately died in the sinking, was too shameful in Robert's mind to acknowledge. Loved ones became desperate for news as the world began learning of the disaster Monday morning. In Richmond, Robert's mother Harriet was growing increasingly anxious. She undoubtedly breathed a sigh of relief the next day when a telegram arrived informing her that her son had been rescued by the Carpathia. Robert became acquainted with Eloise Smith while aboard the Carpathia. In fact, once the ship docked in New York, it was Robert himself who supposedly carried Eloise down the gangplank to meet her father, Congressman Hughes. Eloise returned to Morgantown with her father, and Robert ultimately to Richmond to spend time with his mother. They remained in contact with one another, seeing each other occasionally, and ultimately married in August 1914. The press couldn't get enough of what seemed a fairy tale romance born from tragedy. Perhaps Robert and Eloise bonded over the trauma of their shared experience aboard the Titanic. Whatever the case, the marriage did not last, and the couple divorced in 1923. Eloise made her home in Charleston and became a well-known public speaker and advocate for women's suffrage. She was active in Republican Party politics and also worked for the Pension Bureau in Washington, D.C. Eloise spoke extensively about her experience as a Titanic survivor, and much of the material she provided has been used in various books and films, including the documentary television series Seconds from Disaster.
Most are completely unaware that Titanic has struck an iceberg. Mary and Lucian Smith are in the crowd.
There was no commotion, no panic. No one seemed particularly frightened.
3 successive marriages eventually ended in death and divorce. Eloise died in 1940. Her grave marker in Spring Hill Cemetery in Huntington bears the surname Smith. Although Eloise had been married 4 times, she ultimately chose to retain the surname of the young, gentle Lucian, who kissed her goodbye on the boat deck of the Titanic. Lucian and Eloise streets in Huntington bear the names of the couple whose union ended much too soon. The 2 streets run parallel within sight of one another, but they never meet. Robert Daniel also remarried twice after his divorce from Eloise. In 1926, he purchased and restored Lower Brandon, a 17th century plantation overlooking the James River just south of Richmond in Prince George County. Robert was later elected to the Synod of Virginia and would also serve on the University of Virginia's Board of Visitors, as well as the board of the Richmond Trust Company. Despite his successes in life, Robert struggled privately with alcoholism, fueled by 2 broken marriages and post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from the Titanic disaster. He could never bring himself to discuss the historic event that changed his life. Robert was an active parishioner at Martin's Brandon Episcopal Church, not far from Lower Brandon. During his time here, he generously donated a Tiffany-stained glass window in memory of his sister Isabel. An adjacent window was posthumously dedicated to Robert himself, with emblems recalling his love for his yacht and his horses. Reportedly, Robert asked the vestry never to sing the hymn "Nearer My God to Thee," by most accounts the last song heard from the Titanic's band as the ship began its final plunge. Robert Daniel died at the age of 56 from cirrhosis of the liver and was interred in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. His obituary described a lifetime of achievement, but said nothing of the Titanic. Many of those who survived that night, like those who have survived other traumatic events in history, attempted to put the Titanic behind them and move forward with their lives in whatever manner they knew how. It is easy to forget that behind every historical event lies an intricate web of human experiences. We may never fully understand the story of how Robert Daniel survived the sinking of the Titanic. Silence ultimately deprives our understanding of history when some human experiences are simply too painful to discuss. In 1958, the docudrama A Night to Remember was released, which detailed the night the Titanic sank with noteworthy accuracy. At a special screening of the film in Manhattan, Titanic survivor Irene Harris was overcome with emotion during the scene of the iceberg collision and excused herself from the theater. She later remarked that the title of the film, A Night to Remember, was a mistake. Miss Harris insisted, "It was a night to forget."